We're now on day 13 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and things are looking worse than ever for Putin. Russian casualty numbers are steadily increasing, the West is sending more arms to Ukraine, and Putin's invasion seems to have stalled almost altogether. So in this video, we're going to be trying our best to explain why things are going so badly for Putin, and where things might go next from here. So far, we've released a ton of videos explaining and contextualizing the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So if you want to stay in the loop and understand the war around you, then be sure to subscribe. Currently, only about a quarter of you have, so we'd love your support. We're going to split this video into 3 parts. Firstly, we're going to take a look at the invasion itself and why it's going badly. Secondly, we're going to consider how the international response has continued to harden against Putin, and what further measures the rest of the world could take if the invasion continues. Thirdly, and finally, we're going to be looking at how this might affect Putin's position domestically. Let's get into the first part of the video though, the invasion itself. All in all, it's not going well. As we explained in our previous video, Putin apparently expected less resistance from Ukraine than he's actually experienced, assuming that both the Ukrainian army would be less competent than it's shown itself to be, and that there would be a more pro-Russian sentiment within Ukraine. This at least partially explains Russia's struggles in the first few days of the war, but as time's gone on, things haven't gotten any better for the Russians. While they've captured some more territory, their gains seem to be pretty limited thus far, and the cities and towns that they have taken don't seem to be happy about it. In Kherson, the only major city that Russian forces have successfully taken, there have been massive protests against Russian occupation. Russia has also suffered thousands of casualties. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry estimates 11,000 Russian troops have been killed, and thousands of vehicles, worth probably millions of dollars and perhaps even trillions of rubles, have been destroyed. So why is Putin's invasion still going so badly? Well, a big part of it seems to be down to logistics. Somewhat unsurprisingly, wars are resource intensive. They require a lot of fuel, food, and ammunition. And the Russians weren't really planning on the invasion lasting anything more than a few days, which means that they ran out of immediate supplies pretty quickly, and have since struggled to supply their forces with the resources they demand. When it comes to logistics, the Russian army is uniquely reliant on railroads. That's how they transported most of their forces from Russia to the Ukrainian border. And the Ukrainians know this, which is why the first thing they did when the invasion kicked off was to destroy all railroads going from Russia or Belarus into Ukraine. And while the Russians tried to take Hostomel Air Base, which would have let them airlift supplies directly into Ukraine, Russian forces quickly retook the airbase on March 4th. All of this together means that when the invasion took longer than expected, and the Russian army ran out of supplies, the Russians were reliant on trucks for food and supplies. Now, there's a few problems with this. For starters, Russia just doesn't have that many trucks. In total, the Russian army has about 4,000 specialized trucks, which might sound like a lot, but it's pretty miserable by international standards. For context, while it's hard to count because there's so many variants, the US Army has well over 100,000 similar trucks. Also, remember that wars are seriously resource intensive. For example, the ammunition for a single rocket launcher volley takes an entire truck, and you then need to provide fuel for thousands of vehicles and food for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. In his blog War on the Rocks, US Army Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vashinin estimated that Russia doesn't have enough trucks to supply its army more than 90 miles beyond supply dumps. Furthermore, the trucks that the Russians do have aren't in great condition. Unsurprisingly, military vehicles require a lot of maintenance, and the fact that many of them are falling apart on the Ukrainian roads suggests that the Russians have been pretty lazy about truck maintenance. Ukrainians also know this, which is why Ukrainian forces have been targeting Russian fuel trucks. And this is doubly bad for the Russians, because every time a fuel truck gets blown up, they also ruin the road that they're driving on. The fuel they're carrying burns for hours, melting the tarmac and leaving the Russians with even fewer delivery routes, which have already been limited by the Ukrainian mud created by the spring thaw. these logistical difficulties are probably why the massive military convoy on the way to Kyiv, which stretches to about 64 kilometers long, has apparently stalled. Yep, you heard that right. 64 kilometers of Russian military equipment is just sitting there, according to the latest US intelligence. Things have apparently got so bad that the Russian army has resorted to shipping civilian vehicles, at least according to video reports. This all suggests that Russia is getting incredibly desperate. Civilian vehicles are unlikely to have a good time if specialized trucks are already struggling on Ukrainian roads, which are only likely to get muddier. And that's partly because on March 4th, Ukraine deliberately opened the Kyiv reservoir to intentionally flood the surrounding regions, in order to make things even harder for the Russian invaders. And they've suffered similar problems for years, going all the way back to Afghanistan in the 80s. It's possible that Russia's air force, which has been notably absent during the invasion, is also suffering from similar problems. Originally, analysts assumed this was because Russia was holding back in order to minimize civilian casualties. But recent reportings of cluster bombings in residential areas in Kharkiv and Mariupol have scuppered that hypothesis. You get the point though, logistics have hampered the Russian army's attempts and really limited how far they've got. Now, it's important not to overstate the effect of this on the overall outcome. While the Kyiv convoy might have stalled, Russian forces have been more successful in the south, where they've been able to establish a continuous land bridge from Crimea to Russia, and are now poised on an assault in Odessa. This is probably because Russian forces are closer to established military bases in this area, which makes logistics a lot easier. Nonetheless, you get the point. Putin's invasion has been going badly. On to the second part of this video, the international response. As you probably already know, various sanctions have been imposed on Russia, and the West has continued to supply arms to Ukraine. But things look like they might be about to get even worse for Putin. For starters, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Sunday that NATO could provide Ukraine with fighter jets, a major escalation. The US is also currently considering sanctions on Russian oil exports, and has opened negotiations with Venezuela about easing oil sanctions in order to improve global supply. Now, it's worth saying that the current stance, threatening oil sanctions without actually going through on them, actually helps Putin, because the anticipation of oil sanctions pushes up prices, which Russia benefits from. Nonetheless, if the West does go through with the oil sanctions, then this will seriously hurt Russia's economy. Russia currently sells about $700 million worth of oil and gas to Europe every single day, and they're able to use this foreign currency to prop up the failing ruble. Even with these measures though, the ruble is continuing to collapse in value. At the time of writing, $1 buys 141 rubles, which translates to about a 30% drop in value versus a week ago, and a 50% drop versus a month ago. Obviously then, if the West stops buying Russian oil and gas, the ruble will tumble even further. So far, the West has been reluctant to sanction Russian energy, because it will mean higher energy prices for Europe. But public opinion is apparently turning, and there's an increasing appetite for this kind of action. All in all then, Western arms support to Ukraine has clearly increased, and energy sanctions have become a live possibility for the first time, which brings us to the third and final part of this video, how it affects Putin domestically. As the war escalates, Putin's narrative that this is merely a special military operation aimed at protecting Donbass is becoming increasingly hard to maintain. Russia has already seen unprecedented protests against the war, and on Sunday, Russian authorities arrested more than 4,500 anti-war protesters in just one day. Now, it's important not to overstate domestic opposition to the war in Russia. Recent polling found that 60% of Russians blame NATO for the conflict, and only a third of Russians actually opposed the war. But nonetheless, these numbers are worse than usual for Putin. But as the Russian economy collapses and body bags keep coming back, it's possible that public sentiment will turn. So that's the video. Things are still going badly for Putin, and domestic support for the war certainly isn't unanimous. If you do want more updates on issues like this, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. Not only do we appreciate your support, but with only about a quarter of you subscribed thus far, you could be missing out on further explainers and updates. So be sure to subscribe to better understand the war and the world around you. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.